Prologue, January 2008. The evening sun was setting, and the Straits of Mackinac, blanketed in a rapid-moving winter fog and frozen over since the first day of January, was a path of glittering cold ice, 6 feet thick above the frigid waters. The amethyst shadows, a snow twilight that was not quite night but no longer day, had drifted in, and the whiteness of snow and frozen water wreathed in mist created an eerie landscape that seemed like no place on earth. Mackinac Island sat to the right of the straits, between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. The island's lights were flickering on as the day faded. People were closing their shops, locking the doors, and going home for the night. The tiny houses lit up the snow. Looming behind the island like a monstrous sentinel, Mackinac Bridge, a 5-mile structure of metal and concrete, connected the lower and upper peninsulas of Michigan. The Canadian winds caused the bridge to sway 15 feet in opposite directions. It was decked out like a carnival with strings of gleaming ruby, emerald, and white lights. Though the inhabitants of Michigan appreciated the bridge and its convenience, many travelers were wary because it moved so much. Some refused to drive across it. Even macho truckers sometimes gave up the wheel to a bridge attendant, a braver soul, and let him drive the rig across for them. On the other side, the truckers would reclaim their truck and go on their way, never telling anyone they'd been too frightened to do it themselves. In the late winter, when the ice of the straits froze solid, not everyone used steel bridges to get from one piece of land to another. Some used another kind of bridge, a bridge of frozen water. That night in the dusk, a solitary figure on a snowmobile was chugging across the ice from Mackinac Island towards the mainland of St. Ignace, and staying in close to the curve of cast-off Christmas trees that had been stabbed into the frozen surface. The ice bridge, as islanders called it, was a narrow path stretching 3.5 miles across the straits that separated Mackinac Island from the St. Ignace mainland. To the locals, the ice bridge meant freedom to come and go for up to 2 months a year without paying ferryboat or airplane fees. It meant freedom to go day or night, on no one's schedule. To the mainland to seek entertainment, visit friends, and bring back the supplies they needed. Or it meant freedom to go for a late rendezvous. The snowmobile was building speed, zipping across the ice, sure of the course in the misty light. A quarter of the way across, the driver noticed a slushy area and swerved off the path to the right. A soft snow had begun to fall from the night skies, and the lone traveler, from a distance a larger pale blur among the smaller ones, became more difficult to see. Someone who fidgeted in the woods impatiently watched from the trees on the north side of the island with a pair of binoculars and saw everything the rider did. The man, bundled in second-hand clothes and a shabby coat, observed the snowmobile's progress with cold, calculating eyes. He dropped his smoldering cigarette from a shaking hand and stamped his feet to stay warm as his breath puffed out in pale wisps between the trees. He noted the exact moment when the snowmobile veered off the trail. Then, with a vindictive smile, the man knelt down, pushed a button on a box by his feet, and eagerly observed, as far out on the path, the ice cracked and gave way beneath the snowmobile's treads. "That'll teach you," he thought smugly. "You've always had it so easy. Not any more. I warned you, didn't I? But you wouldn't listen. You wouldn't give me what's mine. So now I'll just take it. There." He chuckled spitefully. Rest in peace. You got what you deserved. The heavy machine sank swiftly into the frigid waters, pulling its rider and one of the evergreens into the hole with it. There was only time for one scream to drift up from the tear in the ice, but, with a ghostly echo, it haunted the night for a brief time, and then, like the snowmobile and rider, it was gone. The darkening dusk was silent again. The ice that covered the water nearly 200 feet deep at that spot, folded over the fissure and began to refreeze into a tomb of ice. The shadow person in the woods laughed gleefully and picked up the box, tucked it beneath his arm, and went in search of warmth and food. He was tickled that he'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. Proud that, for once in his wretched life, he'd been brave and clever enough to do what he'd had to do. Mother, you old witch, wouldn't you be proud of me? It's a shame you're not alive to see it. A real shame. This time, his laugh was softer and full of some strange satisfaction only he understood. The man left the woods and began to hike back across the straits. He knew it would be a long walk, and he'd be frozen by the time he climbed into his junky car and headed home. He didn't care. He smiled the whole way through the snow and hummed an old song his mother used to sing to him when she wasn't too drunk or out of it. He hummed and plotted his next step, and it kept him warm. A few evenings later, the missing tree and the frozen-over hole where the straits had swallowed the snowmobile were discovered by two other islanders on their way back from St. Ignace in the middle of a snowstorm. They reported the anomaly, and the next morning at dawn, island police were called in to investigate. The storm was nearly a blizzard by then, but one of the policemen was insistent that they examine the ice immediately. He believed someone might have fallen through, but if so, past experience pointed to an accident. People had gone into the water before while crossing the ice bridge, and it was tragic, but not unheard of. It happened, and sometimes, as awful as it was the cost they paid for using the bridge. Often the ones who fell in managed to get out or were yanked out, were rescued, but not always. One time, 14 years earlier, a man had gone through the ice, and by the time they'd dragged him out, he was dead from the frigid water. It'd been a long time ago, but accidents did happen. That January morning, the police chopped into the ice, dredged the water below, but couldn't locate a body or a snowmobile. They knew they might not find either until the spring thaws, if they ever found anything. They discovered a mitten, though, embedded in the ice, and someone recognized it as belonging to one of the full-time residents of the island, a woman. They noticed the slushy spot nearby that had already refrozen, and speculated as to what might have happened. In the end, the chief of police had to write it off as an accident because, as he put it, who'd want to harm the victim? No one any of them could think of. The ice bridge has only been in use a few days, and the victim's only been missing, that we know of, for about the same time. The chief spoke aside to his lieutenant. It's easy to see how there might have been a weak spot in the ice this early. She went off the path to avoid what she thought was an unsafe stretch, and, instead, hit a real bad patch. It broke beneath her and sucked her in. Poor thing. At least she died quickly. Drowning in freezing water isn't the worst way to go, Lieutenant. I don't need to tell you that. I know, the other officer replied. You lose consciousness and fall asleep about the time you run out of air. It's pretty quick, the chief snapped his chubby fingers in the air. Terrible thing. But nothing we can do for her now except keep looking for the snowmobile, her body, and fill out the forms. We'll speak to people and investigate further, but I'd wager a week's pay it was accidental." His lieutenant didn't think so. He had nagging questions and was determined to get them answered. There were things at the scene that hadn't looked right to him. He'd never convince his superior of that. Chief Bill Matthews was a pragmatic kind of guy. If it looked like an accident, then it was. Simple as that. Yet, at his lieutenant's insistence, the chief let the other officers circle the site in yellow crime tape so people would avoid it, and afterwards, the ice bridge was reopened. Everyone who used it swerved to the left and went nowhere near the scene of the accident. Many made the sign of the cross over their chest as they passed the spot where the woman might have disappeared, or they said a swift prayer so the ghost of the dead woman wouldn't appear to them. People on the island were superstitious that way.